Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As we reflect on the Qur'an during the month of Ramadan, one of the very interesting passages that we see in the Qur'an in the first juz is in Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us about the story of Genesis, the creation of Adam alayhi salam, and the conversation that is occurring between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the angels as He announces the creation of a new being. وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. When He says to the angels, I am going to create a new being which will have moral authority, which will have an authoritative presence, which will have vicegerency on this earth. And what's interesting is as the conversation unfolds, we also see that the first order that was given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarding this being is for the angels to prostrate, for all those present to prostrate in front of this being out of respect, out of veneration, out of respect that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is the creation of Allah, and it is a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which is grand and which is momentous. And as this conversation is unfolding, we find that one of the interjections or the questions that were returned back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by the angels is, they say, أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاءَ وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِكَ وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ. That are you going to create a being on this earth which will cause bloodshed, which will have that corruptive force and which will cause mischief on this earth? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the response that He gives, but even before the response that He gives, there is a subtle indication in what is the purpose of the creation, of the various creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is to magnify the praises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is to glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it is to be in that constant state of worshipping and obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is also what we find very much corroborated in the Qur'an regarding the purpose of the creation of Adam alayhi salam, of human beings, and of the jinn kind as well. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. That I have not created the jinn kind and mankind except for them to worship me, except for them to obey me, except for them to be in service of me. And so this is the purpose for which human beings were created, and this is what the angels understood this new being would be created for. It would be for the praises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the glorification of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is why we find this interjection that was made by the angels, or this question rather, this counter question by the angels, that are you going to create a being which will be doing all of these immoral things when you have us who are already singing your praises and glorifying you and doing your veneration of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this was a religious position, this was a moral authority that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was creating with this new creation, with this new being. And when the angels were told to prostrate, what was the response? وَقُلْنَا لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ اسْجُدُوا لِآدَمَ فَسَجَدُوا إِلَّا إِبْلِيسَ. فَسَجَدُوا إِلَّا إِبْلِيسَ. Everyone prostrated except Iblis. And one of the reasons, if we're really following this passage, we see that this has a lot to do with the knowledge that comes with that religious and that spiritual position and authority that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala affords us. Because in response to the angels, when they made this interjection and they through this counter question, the response of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was, Inni a'lamu ma la ta'lamun. I know what you do not know. And this was in the perfect knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this theme of knowledge then carries through in the creation of Adam alayhi salam. One of the features of Adam alayhi salam, Inni a'lamu ma la ta'lamun, وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He taught that knowledge of things, of names to Adam alayhi salam. And this was one of the specialities of this being Adam alayhi salam. And again, this theme reoccurs Subhanak, la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana. The angels once again, they admit that, oh Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're perfect. We don't have any knowledge except what you've given us. Right? We don't have any knowledge except what you've given us. And then later on once again, Alam aqul lakum inni a'lamu ma la ta'lamun. Haven't I told you that I know what you do not know, O angels? So this theme of knowledge, it keeps coming up. And this idea of knowledge is something that really elevates a person and brings a person closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what we need to understand as Muslims, as human beings, that in the month of Ramadan, as we reflect on the Qur'an, we will be closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in proportion of the knowledge that we have of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. More knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, more knowledge of our surroundings, and awareness of the purpose of everything around us will bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what I want to really speak about today and highlight today is the friction that happened between Adam alayhi salam and Iblis right at the beginning. That parting of ways happened as a result of that position with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of a religious authority that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was giving Adam alayhi salam, and that vicegerency that Adam alayhi salam was being given. He rejected Adam alayhi salam and he vowed to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at that point, and then all the way until the day of judgment as a result of that rivalry. And this is very, very crucial, because in the month of Ramadan, as we prepare ourselves for improvement, as we try our best to increase our stamina in worshipping Allah, in obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in correcting our engagements with the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in being better husbands, in being better wives, in being better children, in being better parents, in being better friends and maybe colleagues, and in being better people, just to other people. As we aim and as we strive and exert ourselves in the month of Ramadan in doing this as a social exercise, let us also realize that we also need to find a corrective in the Quranic discourse regarding our religious outlook with other people. Because we find in the Qur'an as well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He speaks about knowledge, He also speaks about that as a double-edged sword, that in the same vein that we can elevate ourselves and raise ourselves closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through knowledge. It is knowledge that can become a corruptive force for us as well. وَمَا تَفَرَّقُوا إِلَّا مِن بَعْدِ مَا جَاءَهُمُ الْعِلْمُ بَغْيًا بَيْنَهُم. They did not splinter off into groups, and they did not divide, إِلَّا مِن بَعْدِ مَا جَاءَهُمُ الْعِلْمُ, except after knowledge came to them. Why? بَغْيًا بَيْنَهُم, because of rivalry amongst each other. And this thing of rivalry and using religious language to divide and not to come closer together and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together, this is something which not only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself really distances Himself from us, but in fact He instructs the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to distance himself from this kind of narrative within religion. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ فَرَّقُوا دِينَهُمْ وَكَانُوا شِيَعًا لَسْتَ مِنْهُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ. لَسْتَ مِنْهُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ. That those who divide their religion, and in another reading, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ فَارَقُوا دِينَهُمْ, those who withdraw from the religion, those who disassociate from the religion, وَكَانُوا شِيَعًا, and they become factions and divisions and sects and groups and splinter groups. لَسْتَ مِنْهُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ. You have nothing to do with them. You, O Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, have nothing to do with them. And in fact, Imam al-Tabari, although this verse of the Qur'an is being primarily addressed in the context of the previous nations, the followers of Musa alayhi salam, the followers of Isa alayhi salam, and how they divided themselves into various factions and groups after knowledge had come to them, we find Imam al-Tabari rahimahullah ta'ala, a well-known exegete, Imam ibn Kathir as well, a famous commentator on the Qur'an, they both speak regarding this ayah and the applicability of this ayah for the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. They in fact tell us that أن الآية عامة في كل من فارق دين الله وفرقه وكانوا فرقا فيه وأحزابا وشيعا فهو بريء من النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم والنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم منه بريء. That this verse is general and it applies to everyone who really divides their religion and they break off into factions and they become various they splinter off and they divide themselves and they become sects. فهو بريء من النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. He has nothing to do with the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, and the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم has nothing to do with him. I'd like to point out, inshallah, some of the statements of the scholars, and inshallah cite some of these statements of our great scholars in order to situate this understanding into perspective for us, inshallah, during the month of Ramadan, and of course beyond the month of Ramadan, in our religious discourse and in our religious engagements as well. He says, Imam Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, a well-known scholar of Islam, medieval scholar of Islam, he tells us, وَمَا زَالَ الْفُضَلَاء يَخْتَلِفُونَ قَدِيمًا وَحَدِيثًا في الأصول والفروع لكنهم متفقون على الأصل الكبير وهو توحيد الحق وتمجيده والإيمان به وبصفاته وأسمائه المقدسة من حيث الجملة وقد يختلفون في تفاصيل بعد ذلك. That eminent scholars have for the longest time have really perennially, they've continued to differ in the fundamentals, in the usul, in the foundations, and in the tertiary issues, in the furu', in the subsidiary issues. But they are agreed on the chief fundamental, on the asl, and that is the unification of the absolute truth. That is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, while glorifying Him, while having faith in Him, His lofty attributes, His names, over all. Even if they may subsequently differ in the details, in the minutiae, and only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ultimate enabler. And this is what we find, that even if we may differ in the minutiae of conceiving of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is something that is acceptable, and this is something which is inevitable. One more statement of Imam al-Dhahabi rahimahullah ta'ala. He tells us, لو أننا كلما أخطأ إمام مجتهد, and this is more so amongst the circles of knowledge, but even in the interaction between the circles of knowledge, or the people of knowledge, and their constituencies and their followers. That لو أننا كلما أخطأ إمام مجتهد في مسألة خطأ مغفورا له هجرناه وبدعناه لما سلم أحد من الأئمة والله الهادي للخلق والراحم للخلق. He says that if every time a qualified scholar would issue a mistaken but forgivable, rewardable judgment, if we were to boycott him and we charged him with heresy, with bid'ah, not a single imam would remain undefiled and untainted. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a guide to all truth and is the dispenser of mercy to His creation. Inshallah, this Ramadan, my aim is to try to, inshallah, begin to identify the fault lines that might exist either consciously or subconsciously in my relationship with other Muslims. And I inshallah encourage and I urge all the listeners in to do this as well, that we begin to understand what are the fault lines between myself and my Muslim brothers and sisters, and those whom I disagree with, sometimes even very vehemently and very passionately on very key issues. Let me identify what are the areas and how am I engaging with people whom I differ with, whom I'm not able to see eye to eye with, and then inshallah we try to build systems of bridging that gap between ourselves and our Muslim brothers and sisters whom we disagree with and whom we don't see eye to eye with, by making dua for them in private, by trying to break bread with them, by trying to engage with them, by trying to share with them, by trying to do and engage in all of these activities that will at the very least try to minimize all those aspects, sometimes just in our minds, that exist of us being, having that, building this stereotype of our Muslim brothers and sisters and behaving with them on the basis of these stereotypes. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He bring our hearts together, that we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He instill in our hearts love for each other, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He bring us all together for the purpose of worshipping Him, for the purpose of obeying Him. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He raise us on the Day of Judgment as brothers and sisters and under the banner of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.